Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Parnassus Books. I am so excited about the event tonight. On behalf of myself, my wonderful staff, and my partner emeritus, Karen Hayes, I'm always so glad to see you here. We have an amazing event tonight. So I read color television. Really, it might have been a year ago. It was such a long time ago. And I was so passionate about this book. Now, when you read things really far out, the question is what sticks? Because I read a lot of books that I love, and then 2 weeks later, I couldn't tell you a thing about them. A year later, I think I could recite this book. It made such a huge impression on me. It is funny. It's incredibly entertaining. It captures the zeitgeist, and at the same time, it's important. It has so much weight to it, and the characters are living people that will just stay with you. I am thrilled that Danzy is here, and I am thrilled that she's in conversation with ZZ Packer, although at the same time, slightly jealous because I wish I was doing this event. So Danzy, ZZ, come on up. Oh, and you know, turn your cell phones off. I'm not Elise. Turn your cell phones off and do all of those things. Thank you.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
We were just discussing backstage that it's probably been, what, I don't know, has it been 5, 10 years? I don't even know how many years it's been since we saw each other.
Yeah, but we started out at the same publishing house with the same editor for our first novels.
Yep.
And so there's like a special cohort relationship that we have.
Yep. And then so our editor, well, you had Cindy,
Yeah.
of course, as well.
Yeah.
So our editor at Riverhead, Cindy Spiegel, she's just famous for, I mean, I guess most editors send out just tons of books. Okay, here's who else I'm editing. But, you know, she sent out this like just boxes and boxes of books. And I was like, how can I possibly keep up? And I had, you know, heard of Danzy, and then I was like, okay, Caucasia, I'm just gonna, you know, dive in, look a little bit, first couple of pages, you know, reading 10 books at a time. And I really could not put it down. I mean, I couldn't put it down. And it was just such an incisive, you know, cross-section of how it was for this young girl to grow up with this, you know, family in which she had, I'm now afraid to use the word interracial family because I'm just gonna be like, okay, it's a mulatto, yeah, she's a mulatto, like she's.
So I'm bringing this archaic racist word back into fashion.
I mean, but also Skip Gates is a fan of that word.
Yeah.
And there are some quadroon references in here throughout as well, which he will sometimes also use.
Yeah, no, he called me that.
Okay. This is being recorded, right?
Right.
But the thing was that, you know, here it was, this book that actually just was so incisive and wasn't afraid to just lay out a lot of just like racial politics, but also interpersonal politics, you know, interpersonal relations that people just won't talk about or don't seem to ever want to talk about. And then, of course, we have the long-awaited, you know, color television, you know, and this is doing the same thing, but in just almost hyperdrive. I mean, everything I loved about Caucasia, I really love about this. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that I was, you know, emailing and sending snippets and little screenshots of the pages to various friends. And the reason is because it will go there. I mean, it's just saying all of this stuff about race that other people won't say. So can you talk about, you know, how you came to I don't want to say make corner the market, but
Corner of the market.
you're doing. I mean, you're doing so much in which you. For instance, I don't know if you would like to read a passage. But
Yeah, why don't I read a passage from this crazy book? And I apologize to everyone for anything that's offensive. I don't know. I just say that. I don't mean it. So I think this is a novel about a novelist. It's a very sort of navel-gazing novel about a novelist who is frustrated, has been working on her second novel for 10 years. And it's a sort of novelistic history of the mulatto people from the beginning in America. And she goes from Sally Hemings to Zoe Kravitz. Like she goes a big time span. And it's a big bloated monster that sort of destroyed her life. And her family is living in poverty, as it happens when you don't have anything to give to your publisher. And her husband is an artist, a black artist who refuses to do any images of black bodies in his paintings, and so his paintings don't sell either. And so they have 2 children, and they are sort of house sitting for a rich friend, and she's deep with envy for this screenwriter's life. And so I sort of explore in this novel her exploration and journey into television writing, and her involvement with this television producer. So that's kind of the front story, but I'm going to just read a little bit, just about 10 minutes of a flashback to when Jane, the main character, and her husband Lenny first meet in Brooklyn 10 years ago. Jane first met Lenny at a house party in Brooklyn. He'd come on the arm of another woman. Jane had come alone. She'd just been emerging from a bad breakup, the latest in a string of them. She was not usually the sort of woman to go after another woman's man, and she might not have done so had it not been for the psychic. Not that she believed in psychics, not now, not then. But the first session had been an early birthday gift from her sister, who had a long relationship with the occult. Jane found the psychic's soothing voice over the phone comforting. His name was Wesley Brown. On his website, he had not actually used the word psychic. Instead, he'd called himself an intuitive psychodynamic counselor with a specialty in racial alchemy. In their first session, he told Jane that her future husband was on his way, nearly there. The way he said it, with a kind of bemused certainty, made Jane understand why her sister liked him so much. He was more fun than a therapist. Across the room at the party, a black man was standing at the chip table alone, shoveling corn chips with salsa in his mouth. He was wearing Vans sneakers and a t-shirt that said, "Part of the problem." What was it that the psychic had predicted? He'd said that Jane was about to meet a black man who was funny, a black man who would be wearing West Coast shoes. The Vans were definitely West Coast, and the t-shirt was funny, pretty funny. She sidled over, drink in hand. "Do you live around here?" she asked. "Brooklyn? No, I hate Brooklyn. People here are pigs." She asked him where he lived instead. "Nowhere, really." He wiped the chip grease off his mouth with a cocktail napkin. "I'm staying in LA for now. I hate it there too, different breed of pigs." They introduced themselves. They got into a strange, joking discussion, she didn't remember how, about ice cream. Lenny said a person's choice in ice cream was influenced by their race. He said that Chinese people tended to like pistachio, white people liked sloppy flavors like Rocky Road or anything with a lot of chunks in it, and black people liked clean and tidy flavors like mint chocolate chip. Were they flirting? She couldn't tell. His eyes roamed the room occasionally as if he were looking for someone else. Jane was trying to think what else to say to interest this man when a woman appeared beside him. She slid her arm through his, kissed his cheek, gave Jane a cutting look, then whispered something in his ear. So he was taken. Jane found herself surprised by the presence of the woman, who had not been in the psychic's prediction. She found herself scanning the room for a different black man, a second funny black man in West Coast shoes. But there was nobody, only miles of white writers and a few racially ambiguous mystery meat types like herself. When she looked back at Lenny and the woman, they were speaking to each other in low lover tones, as if she weren't there, and she felt her throat catch. She felt as if she were already involved with this guy, as if she was already his mistress. Jane had been in New York for 10 years at that point. She'd moved there after college, still believing that her life would unfold in a certain order. First, she would launch her career. Then, after a series of difficult but teachable moment love affairs, she would meet the one, her future mate, and settle down somewhere outside the city where they would spawn beautiful, gifted children. Later, when said children grew up and went to college at a school that looked exceptionally good on a bumper sticker on her Audi, Jane would spend the rest of her days writing novels and tending to her yard in Eileen Fisher clothes, her face set in deep thought like a kind of Pema Chodron for the biracial set. She would age gracefully as a rich Buddhist. But it did not happen that way. The night she met Lenny, she'd already reached that Didion-esque moment when her life in the city began to feel repetitive, stunted. At her 33rd birthday party, she found that she'd lost interest in dating altogether. The parties all began to look alike. She was no longer able to remember why she'd broken up with her previous boyfriends. She'd gotten to the part of the story where she began to circle back, calling exes late at night to see if they wanted to get back together. By then, she had quite a number of ex-boyfriends, a spate of them. Some boys, some men, relationships that had each lasted long enough for them to take off the condom. Her married sister always said serial monogamy was like being a slow cooker hoe. And Jane had the medical records to think maybe her sister was right. A few infections, nothing fatal or permanent, a malformed cell on her cervix that had needed to be burned off, something else that required a tube of antibiotic cream squeezed inside of her, the perils of the journey. Many of the men had wanted to settle down with Jane, but she hadn't been ready. In her 20s, she had wanted nothing to do with domesticity, and this not wanting had made her the target of several good men. Looking back, it seemed she'd spent the decade dodging engagement rings flung at her across taxi seats. She'd wanted to stay a precocious girl woman, to tend to her own needs forever. She'd been satisfied with the performance of marriage without the ring, the rising action of discontent, the falling action of the breakup, the escape to freedom before the story started all over again. For so long, she'd found her own foibles interesting. But now, on the cusp of 33, everything had started to look different. The suitors had stopped throwing the rings at her, for one thing. When she called them late at night, one by one, over the course of the year, she'd learned that somebody else had caught those flying rings. Kamau told her with delight that he was expecting his first baby with a filmmaker named Shari. Chino told her that he was in love with an Irish girl and moving to Dublin. Farouk told her that he was now happily living with somebody named Gavin. Benjamin told her that he was still in love with her, but that his therapist had helped him to see all the ways she was a narcissist. He said he needed to go no contact. She'd even called Colton the last of the white boys, the one with the scratchy lumberjack beard, who told her he had moved upstate with someone named Susan. Jane wished them all well. After she hung up, she stared at the dried flower arrangement on her mantel that looked like kindling for a fire, a design trick she'd learned from Domino magazine. She wanted what the exes had or were about to get: a child on the way, a mortgage to pay, a Volvo, a pile of laundry that needed washing. That same year, a catalog showed up in her mailbox for Hannah Anderson, a Swedish-inspired clothing company out of Oregon she'd never heard of before. They mostly sold children's clothes, but there was sleepwear for adults, too. The catalog was addressed to the roommate who had moved out a long time ago. Jane was about to throw it in the trash when the picture on the cover caught her eye. A family of 4 were wearing matching striped pajamas and laughing. A medium brown-skinned black man and a beautiful brown-skinned black woman with high cheekbones, the 2 of them flanked by perfectly adorable boy and girl of the same skin tone. Jane went to the couch and began flipping through the catalog. The same kids modeled the clothes inside. In a few images, they appeared with their quasi-parents, too. Jane's mouth watered as she stared at the shots of them lounging around a swimming pool in matching bathing suits. In another photo, the mother and daughter walked on the beach holding hands in matching mother-daughter sundresses. They were all of them always smiling, perpetually on the verge of laughter. What was so funny? Jane wanted to know. She kept the catalog beside her bed for months, and when she was not looking at it, she'd think of the family inside with a peculiarly intense longing. She thought of them when she was standing shivering on the subway platform in Brooklyn in her combat boots, or on her way to a party in a giant parka, or even while at the party, staring at the faces of her drunken, bellowing friends. She perused the catalog at night, alone in bed when she was tired, so tired, gazing unblinking at the black family who were exploding together with joy. She called her mother one night and confessed something shameful. She wanted to settle down, have a few kids, live in the suburbs. Her mother, the aging beatnik, perpetually single, said that she couldn't believe she'd raised a daughter who had such bourgeois restoration hardware fantasies. Wasn't it ironic, she said, how women spent their 20s trying to catch a man and have his babies, then spent the next decade wishing they could escape through a bathtub drain. Settling down was just a euphemism, she said, for inching toward death. Death was the ultimate form of settling down. She said Jane should pine to create great art instead, because in the end, men were letdowns and kids were disappointments who grew up, like Jane and her sister, to blame their mothers for everything. Only art and friendship remained. Jane hung up and called her sister, who told her that her mother was full of white feminist second-wave claptrap, that she'd always cared more about feeding her own ego than feeding her half-caste children. Don't you remember how awful it was for us growing up, Jane? Don't you remember what we went through? Don't listen to her, Jane. She's toxic. That was when her sister said that Jane needed a psychic. There was this guy, a friend of a friend, who had predicted her own husband in a roundabout way. Now he was a psychic to the stars. He'd set Jane straight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this sets in motion the entire novel because Jane has these dreams of domesticity and that kind of restoration, hardwood slash, craftsman home, and I think when I got to the point where she's describing, at first, in her, and Nusu Nusu, which is the novel that she has.
The bloated novel.
The bloated, okay, this was 450 pages, I'm gonna say mine. It's way more than that, so I kept
You were
seeing.
like, that's nothing.
Yeah, I kept seeing myself in this. But she then talks about in the more modern iteration, there's multicultural Mayberry. And then it turns out that there actually is this sort of area of LA that she thinks of as being multicultural Mayberry. And so this is what she wants. She wants, the kind of the stability. And then she wants this for her daughter Ruby, and then she wants her son to be able to prosper and maybe, and he's neurodivergent. And so you have all these wishes that she wants, and yet you have all of these other people who are kind of, in a way, getting in the way. So she then kind of proceeds to say, okay, well, if things don't work out, I'm going to
Sell out.
Yes, I'm going to sell out.
Sell out to television.
Yeah.
Right. Well, in a way, it's like, I was talking to someone about this, just that it's almost like my first novel was about racial passing, and this is about a different kind of passing because she's passing within her own marriage, too. I mean, he thinks they're going to be sort of nomadic artists together and live just for art's sake. And she secretly wants this catalog fantasy. And so, this is like zooming forward to their marriage, 10 years in, when it gets sort of exhausting to hold up an illusion that you want the same thing as your partner, and especially when you have no money, and what you want is money. So
Yeah.
it's a precarious time in the marriage, and she sort of keeps a lot from him, and she's afraid of his judgment, if he should know.
But also the thing is, it's so honest. I mean, I know it sounds weird to say that a book of fiction is so honest. When she then discovers at that same party that he's, hooked up with Lilith, this woman named Lilith, and then the description, actually, when she talks to her, to the psychic Wesley, she says, listen, I'm outside this party. There's this guy here. He's exactly how you described. But the thing is, he's with another woman, seriously with her, a poet, an anorexic poet, a white anorexic poet. And then eco-poet, sorry. Eco-poet. And then there's just always these, like, every paragraph or every other paragraph is just sort of filled with absolute, like, almost just dead-on ringer, versions of what's happening today. And they're both these race people. I mean, I don't know if everyone in the audience knows that, but to say a race woman and a race man. And so she has this way in which she is, she has completely studied everything about mulattoes, with the fictional Hiram Cavendish, is it right?
Right.
And then, but she's also just kind of like, she'll say privately the kinds of things that a lot of like Black people won't say in mixed company. She'll say, I secretly, I was going to save him from being with this woman, with Lilith.
She says, like, it's awkward when she says when she hates the same thing as Strom Thurmond, which is seeing an interracial couple, but it's Black manhood she wants to protect from white women.
Yeah,
I don't know if this joke is landing. But
no, I'm probably not. I'm not setting
book,
it up.
I swear. It's funny.
And then she's able to, kind of catalog all of the ways in which, when she describes Lenny. And I'm so sorry if I keep the whole time I know I'm not supposed to think autobiographically, but I just kept thinking, okay, you're brilliant. Percival's brilliant. I always kept thinking, okay, Lenny is sort of caviar Black, where he sort of was born into, a very upper middle class, if not, wealthy.
Yeah, they have a really different class background. And so much of the book is, there's race is sort of constant in all of my work. Every book I write, it's just the landscape and the way that I see the world. But class is a really big part of this book too. And at some point, her father says to her, race and class, like race is class in America, and there's no separating the two. But I think with this marriage, part of their tension is to do with class background. And there's this quote by Carl Jung, that I think I'm going to mess it up, but it's the greatest influence on any child is the unlived life of their parent. And Lenny comes from solidly, his parents didn't divorce, a Black bourgeois professional family where they never moved, they had the same house, everything was stable. And he wants for his children, for them to roam the world and be bohemian artists. And the children don't need to stay anywhere for very long. They can switch schools every year and live in other countries. And Jane comes from bohemian artists, that mother that you hear, and her father. They're divorced, they're an interracial couple, and she moves between their two houses constantly, her and her sister. And for her, that's her nightmare, is to have her children be raised as bohemian artist children.
And they're described as Patty Hearst and Huey P. Newton, right? Like
Patty Hearst and Huey P. Newton were her parents.
And then there's the father having this room, and the father being kind of very much, I'm trying to say this in a nice way, but he's so over everything that America has.
Lenny?
No, not just Lenny, her father.
Oh, her father.
So when the sister goes back, the sister is talking about getting her scholarship, and then the father is like, oh, you're going to think that you're special, don't believe when white people tell you you're special, and also don't believe when they tell you that you're,
He's saying that
piece
when,
of shit.
Yeah. Yes. Her father and the mother are very much like outsiders and iconoclasts, and So the great shame to her mother, or the horror to her parents, is that she so deeply wants a bourgeois life. And so I'm trying to write about money sort of in this book, and the hunger and the aspiration for this fantasy life that she holds. And it's not and it's definitely not a white world she wants. She's found this place where that she calls multicultural Mayberry, where she says, you know, the 1950s charm has had a love child with the Obama-esque future, and this is the neighborhood in which everyone's a different race, and everybody's prosperous, and we all live together in sort of relative wealth.
But then you have someone, someone like Brett, who she's gone to her, am I revealing too much if I mention all of this?
No,
who she's going to her MFA with, and then they're kind of have this like almost sort of sibling bond, and he's the one who kind of makes it in Hollywood, and she's forged this literary career. But the thing that she ends up saying to him that I thought was just another absolute gem, when she's talking about how, you know, she has a thing that he lacked, and that was Black consciousness. And how do you, and then you begin to just sort of show bit by bit her version of it and Lenny's version of it. And then Lenny's version is kind of, I always wondered, we get to see so much of her. Lenny's version seems like a version built off of not having to worry about class as much. And then you're exploring how basically they're I don't really want to say incompatible, because they're to me they seem actually relatively compatible, but they also just have these varying world views about art versus reality, and what one is willing to sacrifice for it.
Yeah, I really wanted to write about a marriage that I hadn't seen, and I'm always trying to write worlds that I haven't seen represented before, that I sort of know intimately, and you know, and that's sort of what she's trying to do in this mulatto history, because as much as the biracials are visually everywhere, I think those stories actually are very undertold of mixed race Black and white people in America. But the other story that I sort of was hungering to see was a story about a marriage that's like, you're deep into the marriage, and it doesn't have, and it's a man and a woman, and they're both creative and sort of obsessed with their work, but it doesn't have the kind of like Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath vibe, where the man is like it's sort of the toxic patriarchy, and the woman is expected to stay home. Like there's sort of an equality to their relationship to work and how much they take care of the children. And so those things are quite equal relatively, but problems remain that are sort of different problems that are just marriage, like, you know, full-grown adult marriage problems that I was interested in.
Yeah, because he's supportive of her writing and wants her to continue to write, and it's sort of her having to sort of sneak around and do this thing to actually try to support them. But you know, I kind of, sorry if I'm being very personal, but I was like, I'm getting mad at Lenny, who's sort of like saying, oh, well, you need to go out and do this to support, you know, to finish the novel so you can have less teaching and support us and whatever. And I'm just like, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. And I kept thinking there are so many inside jokes as well. I mean, I kept thinking, not to say that Hank Willis Thomas is the person who will explicitly put well, actually, I guess he is. The people explicitly put sort of Black figures in the work. But at every point, I kept thinking, okay, this seems representative of this, or this is how
This is why this book, I'm like, where can I move next? I've got to get out of LA now. I've already skewered Brooklyn. Nashville. I feel like I'll never work in that town again.
But LA also becomes this kind of character, too, because in every chapter, there's this just great description of it in terms of not just how it looks, but like it's kind of how it doesn't feel like it has to. It already is what it is, you know.
It doesn't have to prove itself.
It doesn't have to prove itself.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've been fascinated with LA for the entire time I've been living there, and I kept wanting to write an LA novel. And I've been voraciously reading the literature of Los Angeles for these 18 years. And I love Nathaniel West and Joan Didion and all of these depictions of the city. And I love all the sort of like films about LA too, like Barton Fink and
Yep.
The Player, and it's just like a genre that I love, is things about LA, and the darkness and the light and the sort of feeling of desperation there for all the people that are on the outskirts of that kind of gilded class. Like every Uber driver is an actor and is just waiting for that lucky break, and then there's all the people who work in film who aren't extremely wealthy, and it's just a part of LA that interests me, but I'm always looking for representations of as well.
And then you get these side characters like Topher and Layla who just really liven everything up, who are kind of like, they're the people who, like you're saying, aren't the people who are, compensated.
The exploited class in Hollywood.
Yeah, and I dare say, I don't want to reveal too much, but, with Jane not, sort of trying her best to get a foothold. And so then we come to, like, Hampton. Do you want to talk about him a little bit? I'm just
so
curious.
He's the producer. So this is her big dream, is to sneak around behind her husband's back. It's like an affair she's having, but it's actually, she's cheating on her novel and her husband at the same time by trying to write for Hollywood with this other man. And he is sort of cynical, and he's been hired by the television network to create diverse content, which is just, I love like unpacking those words. And he is looking for the next like race to brand, basically. Which race can I make a lot of money off of? And she goes in at the right moment and pitches to him, I want to make a comedy about mulattoes. And that's as specific as she gets. And he is doing the numbers in his head, and mixed race people are the fastest growing demographic in this country, and like everyone's kind of aware of that to some degree, but not aware of it. It hasn't really been done by television and film, and so he latches onto this, and she has to just pitch idea upon idea of how they're going to do this. Jackie Robinson of biracial comedies. How are they going to do the greatest mulatto comedy ever to hit the small screen, is what he says. Of course, there is no other. So it's kind of part of the joke, because it will be the greatest because there won't be any other. But
except that there's also that little dose of the Kardashians, where he kind of is sort of riffing off of going to a particular party and seeing the Kardashians, and the sort of notations of like how the Kardashian women really
have
sort of,
so many biracial babies.
Yeah,
yes,
you sort of
yes.
usurp this idea of
Yeah.
blackness by way of these,
Yes.
biracial children.
Yeah, and the sort of feeling of like a factory, a biracial baby factory that the Kardashians have.
And then
Yeah.
also he's sort of swarmy in terms of he's trying to promote himself as being a person who's incredibly progressive and beyond, any of the Lenny, I think, calls him pretty much step and fetch it.
Step and fetch
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
And yet we see that he just kind of, he can't help himself, like in terms of sinking into Hollywood land.
Right. Yeah. No, I
Parnassus
mean, I think at some point, Jane says, ever since she'd moved to LA, she'd been trying to find it. And I think there's something like, she didn't find LA because LA was now inside of her like a virus. And I was interested in the idea of like LA, sort of, you live there long enough and at some point it infects you and you become part of the machine. And he's fully infected with the virus of LA. And I love LA, so I mean, I'm happy to be within that disease town. But I was writing about it in a kind of, like slightly cynical way, and
Absolutely.
trying to evoke that feeling, which I know you know.
If we should moved on to questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can see why that you said in book page, your interview, that your work is uncategorized. So my question to you is, if your work, if the industry does not know how to categorize your work besides fiction, how do you categorize your work and you?
So at one point in the novel, actually, Lenny says to Jane that her problem as a writer in this marketplace of books is that she has a category confusion, that people don't know where to put her and like which shelf to put her on. And that's, something I know very well, having been writing for 6 books about the people who are neither nor, who are sort of the mulatto nation, of which I am, was born. And I'm always told that I'm writing about mixed race identity, and I actually think it's the geography of my work. It's not the subject. I think I'm writing from that position, that vantage point, like any writer is writing from the world in which they emerge. And I'm writing about marriage, class, power, all sorts of things. But that is the world from which I write, and I feel very much that those are my people. If there's, that group of uncategorizable people are the people in which I come.
Yeah, and very much the culture wars. I mean, academia, like literary, the sort of literary fiction versus the commercial fiction. I love this sort of geography of a place with LA and everything that you're evoking with. But I also just sort of think in terms of not being categorizable, that one of the things that ends up happening is that all these kinds of the Cavendish kind of article excerpts end up showing how a little ridiculous it is to try to have these categories in the first place. It's always sort of this sort of like, okay, everything is about the tri-race, the Melungeons, biracial people, mulattoes, and what the mulattoes mean in terms of.
I mean, at the same time, these are absurd categories that were invented out of slavery and white supremacy, invented these terms and these categories. But I grew up in an era in which I was born in 1970, and my father's black, my mother's white, and I grew up at a time when you just identified as black, if that was your background. And it wasn't a negative force thing. It was out of the black power movement and the civil rights movement. It was a political choice and a kind of, I think my family was inoculating us for the racism of the world by strengthening that identity, because the other one was going to be taken care of. So so that's, the kind of, my multiracial identity was very rooted in blackness, just because of the time in which I was born and the way that was defined at the time. And
but I also like Janie. I was going to say Janie. Jane has this way in which she's talking about how, okay, everyone tries to think of this as being like loving versus Virginia, but she has this sort of way of thinking, hating. Like, well, look, there are these ways in which we're forced to be one particular way, but then we're not post-racial, and so it's left up to her and Lenny to kind of always do the thinking, not just only within their own little family, but in opposition to everyone else, who comes along and is absolutely less progressive than both of them.
right, exactly.
So, Zizi, this is the question that I said you ask her this question.
Oh, yes, the painter question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for keeping me on task. I mean, so Percival, which is Percival Everett, Danzy's, lucky to be Danzy's spouse, paints, and Lenny paints. So to what degree do you feel as though, you are able to explore any of that here? Like what it's like to be a painter, what it's like to be in a literary family in which you also have another art that's also. prominent?
I mean, people always assume that I'm the main character, and then they sort of do the calculation, and my husband must be Lenny, and my kids must be Ruby and Finn, and I actually feel that I'm all of the characters, and that I am taking little pieces of myself and making them into different characters. That said, I am ruthless about stealing from everyone I know, and they all in my birth family, and my husband and my mother and everyone is like, be careful what you say around Danzy, because it will be a detail she steals. And so by the time, I think Jeanette Winterson said that trying to ask someone where the autobiography begins, or the fiction begins and the autobiography ends, is like asking you to turn wine back into grapes. And the process is so complex, and there's so many drafts, and this is completely fiction. And I always feel like, I have to defend the fact that what I'm doing is a complete invention. These are not pages from my diary. Like, that feels always like it takes the artistry away from me, and the labor away from me, and the construct that writing fiction requires. It is not, there's nothing like matchy-matchy about this. It's so many drafts later, it's something else. And so, yeah.
Absolutely. I feel as though even though I am not, don't share much in terms of identity with Jane, I just kind of felt as though, like, oh my God, did someone write this book about me? Like, all the different kinds of ways in which you're touching on, like, Plowshares. It says, oh, well, you could just stop writing the novel and just submit something to Plowshares. Or towards the end, I won't get too into it, but there's the character Ziziba that appears, and there's so many things that are just very much inside baseball and inside jokes, and you can tell the labor of this because, as I said before, every paragraph, there is just an emotional and psychological resonant truth about this. And it's sort of concentric circles, like the culture wars, but also race in America, and also class in America, and also just like, the situatedness of a particular geography, and the sort of, coastal elites versus, like when there's a, having lived in the Boston area, there's a sort of section that talks about, I guess, Jane when she's growing up, and she's one of the Metco kids. Yeah. And then I had this very,
That's a busing. I was bussed in the Boston desegregation years. My sister and I were the kids on the bus being rocks thrown at our bus by white children. Yeah. So that's an era that kind of comes up a little bit in here, but it's more the subject of my first novel.
The Caucasia. Yeah. And then all of it is just, it's just, there's so many layers to it, and yet it's so insanely readable. And now I'm a little hesitant because I hate the word relatable as well, and Jane as a teacher is against the word relatable, which I myself am against. But then I kept not being able to sort of stop being able to just continue, just read this nonstop. That's how amazingly
you binge watched.
Addictive. Yes, I did. I felt like I was binge watching,
Yeah, question. There's a question.
So thank you for being here. One of the things I find so impressive about anyone who writes a novel is just how long it takes and how much time and energy. You can only write so many in your lifetime, right? So my question for you is, as you sit here now and your book is published, is there something about this book that you are, I'm more curious about your personal journey. Is there something that you are most proud of that you did differently this time, a topic that was hard for you? I don't know, it's a very open-ended question, but something you can share with us about your process here.
It was, and so much of this book is sort of referring to how hard writing novels is, and why she abandons it at some point is it's so lonely and sort of terrifying. And you also, I find when I was younger, I could sort of live on coffee and wine and crackers and stay up all night writing and, come home from work and write and edit. And now I have a job and a mortgage and children, and writing fiction, and especially writing a novel, for me, requires you to go into a kind of dream state. And it, for me, only works when I'm always thinking about it, even between those times I'm writing. And so it very much feels in competition with my life a lot of the time. And I was trying to kind of explore that feeling of why it's so intoxicating and my first love always, but why it's something I struggle with, that fact that it just can consume me and it can feel claustrophobic and isolating and all these things. And I was thinking of like sort of manic depression, and writing novels becomes like the depressive space, and Hollywood becomes the manic space. And of course, neither of them is completely that, but in her mind in this book. And what I've sort of done in the last few books is that I've really created boundaries around my writing time, and I write outside of the home, and it's like I'm crate training my novel writing experience, where I don't want it to like infect the whole house and pee everywhere. And so I just do it in a kind of like, as if I'm like checking into work at this library, and then I leave and I can't stay later than a certain amount of time because it feels like it keeps me from losing it. But with this book, I think what I'm most maybe happy about is that I had all of these different parts that I wanted to weave together, and it took me years to figure out, like, this, there's a sociologist, a sort of academic work that she's interested in that's about the history of, or the sociology of the mulatto people that's from the 1930s, and that like somehow I was able to keep putting these sections into this contemporary Hollywood story. And just that, you know, sort of crazy patchwork you're doing when you write a novel, where you know, the novel is like one of the most flexible forms of art, where you can put a recipe in and all these different things in it, but it takes a lot of time to like smooth out those edges, and it's physically exhausting actually writing novels, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, you can sort of see, I mean, I kind of always wonder with people who are in LA, similar to Jane here, like, you know, Hollywood for her is a respite in some ways, even though on the one hand it's like, okay, well, this can possibly turn into a paycheck, you know, and provide my dream. But, you know, she just talks about how, okay, with the novel, and, you know, she always had to get her glass of wine and wind down, and then, you know, balance the kids.
That reminds me of one thing I did take stole from just a meeting I had with a Hollywood agent, and this you might recognize in the book, but the agent said to me that, I said, I'm a novelist and I want to get work in television, because I was sort of doing some of what she does. I was trying to make some extra money. And this agent said that, like, oh, we get novelists in here every day wanting to transition. She used the term transition, which I thought was funny, like a trans genre, right? And she said that she just had someone come and said that they were going to take a break between novels, and that could they be put in a writer's room. And so she got this novelist a job in a writer's room for just 10 weeks or something. And that show ended, and she said, oh, okay, that was great. You got that chance to do that to the novelist. And the novelist said, please don't make me go back in that lonely room. Get me another job in the writer's room. And they were like, don't make me go back to a novel. And I just thought that was so funny that I had to use it.
Yeah. Well, Gary, there's plenty of people that we know that do that. Or they're, you know, off doing, you know, Gary Steinhardt does the HB, worked on, what was it, Succession?
Yeah. And I was also kind of interested in, I'm a professor, I teach creative writing in English department, and she says this at one point, like, I was really interested in the fact that even the English professors, the people who've devoted their whole lives to the study of literature, stand around talking about Succession.
Yeah.
I'm like, is anyone going to talk about a novel? And everyone would talk about White Lotus. And I was like, noticing in the faculty lounge, that was like, nobody was talking about anything but television. And then you start to wonder as a novelist, like, am I in the right storytelling field for this moment?
But here's a question, though. Do you think of some of the you know, I will say with one of my writing friends, will say, oh, okay, I'm going to rewatch The Sopranos or The Wire, because we think of them as like almost, you know, of course they're
Art.
not. Yeah, we think of them as art. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't really
don't get
have a. No, I do. I love television, and I don't sort of separate things in a high-low way. I feel differently and more intimate when I read a novel because I'm doing all the visualizing, all the. The reader is so much more active than the viewer. We are doing, as readers, part of the work of creating the story. So you're a collaborator with the novelist, and that's a completely different experience. It's more, for me, whole body when I'm reading a novel, but I sometimes don't have the energy to be whole body, and that's when television is great. But I think some of the writing is amazing in television, and I love writing dialogue, and you know, I think some of the
You're a great
dialogue
dialogue writer.
in these shows is incredible. And I mean, what's interesting is I started this book before the pandemic. Then the pandemic happened. I had to put it in a drawer for a long time because my kids were home. And then it was like I started it at the height of prestige television. And by the time I had finished it, the whole industry had collapsed. And it was sort of followed the arc of the novel in a weird way. But yeah.
And there's a mention in here too about not just the reader having to do all this stuff when they're, you know, when they're interfacing with the novel, but of course the writer is having to be director, set designer, like produce
play all
characters.
these parts. You have to be every
absolutely.
actor in this. Yeah, like you're actually doing everything that's on a movie, but you're having to do all of it instead of having other people. Yeah.
You had mentioned one time, and I don't want to take questions
Yeah,
away from the audience. Oh, wrap it up. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Oh, so just finishing, I kept thinking, oh my God, so many things you had mentioned about, like, I hope I don't offend anyone. And I was thinking, there's so much stuff that I feel as though it's just so brave that I'm like, okay, and not only that you wrote, but that an editor is like, okay, we'll put this out there. This is going to be able to fly. Did you have any qualms at all, or did your editor or anyone say, okay, you have to remove this, or this is a little too close to?
All right, you want to know something funny? This is not even about being offensive, but is my editor going to watch this video? Oh, wow. I have this is so weird, but I have a joke in here that was so inside baseball for a novelist. And she said, nobody's going to get this joke. And it was that Jane is talking about how she thinks novelists are boring and staid and that they're too obsessed with awards. And she said it's the whole Marion Ettlinger.
Actually, that one, I was just like, it's the whole Marion Ettlinger of it all.
Yes. And
Marion
does
Ettlinger
anyone know who
is
that is?
Yes, you know.
See, I was like, I want to keep this in for the 5 people who are going to get this joke.
And then
Is
it
that
follows
okay?
with
She
stony
takes
face.
those author photos that look like they're etched in stone. And so she was like, this joke is just funny to me. And I was like, but you and 5 other people are going to really get this joke.
I saw that and I circled it. I was like, I can't believe she put Marion Ettlinger in here. You know, and it's followed by the stony or stone-faced and whatever. And it's really, I mean, I will admit, I do have a Marion Ettlinger
I know you
photo.
do. I've seen it. You do too, right? You do too. I
Because
don't, so I can make the joke. But
Yeah.
I wanted one.
Yeah.
I wanted one.
Are the what? There's another one, and I promise I'll. And no, so with her writing teacher, her and Brett's writing teacher. Who there's several little inside jokes where one is the little moments from the Art of Fiction, you know, from John Gardner's The Art of Fiction, as well as his book in pale imitation of the Carver, et cetera, and all the other Richards and Tonys and whatever.
The Jonathans. No, the Jonathans.
The Jonathans. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, the thing is, I always try to write toward the smallest possible audience and then hope that it lands on a larger scale. But I have a little writers group. It's like just 3 other women in LA. Yes.
Yeah.
And they all get all of my jokes, and so they indulge me. They're like enablers, and I just show it to them, and if they get it, then I'm okay. But I I'm lucky that some other people seem to have gotten some of the jokes in here. But it's like a very comic novel. I mean,
It absolutely-
it's
yeah.
like I think with this book I let myself like really lean into my comic sensibilities, but I'm hoping that because for me that was all filled with rage and other emotions that for me the most interesting comedy has in it. So that was kind of where I was coming from with this. Yeah.
It is addictive. I just encourage everyone to get it. I mean, I will probably just end up buying several just for various students in my workshop and friends
I'm
that I've.
scared my students are going to read it because there's so much about
About
her
teaching.
loathing of teaching.
I saw that too.
It's like literally, I'm coming to Nashville and I'm going to have to work here at this bookstore. So please hire me. I'm done in LA and New York. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was great. Oh my gosh.
But thank you all so much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zizi. That was so fun. So fun.